Acts 4, verses 32 to 37 on page 1096. The believers share their possessions. All the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of his possessions were his own, but they shared everything they had. With great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and much grace was upon them all. There were no needy persons among them. For them, time to time, those who owned lands or houses sold them, brought the money from the sales and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone as he had need. Joseph, a Levite from Cyprus, whom the apostles called Barnabas, which means son of encouragement, sold a field he owned and brought the money and put it at the apostles' feet.
Thank you. Well, have you ever tried to imagine a perfect community? I wondered whether there's anyone here who's actually been part of a spiritual community. Anyone ever done that? Gone there? Been into a monastic community or a retreat centre? No. Oh, somebody has. We'll have to have a word with Bob's friend later. I suppose it gives you, if you are in that community, you begin to realize there is no perfect community. And if you're in a family, living with people you're related to, you know that your family is not entirely perfect. Maybe you'd say quite a lot, actually. Now, I may be a bit biased now, but I am getting more and more drawn into life at St. Edyth. And I feel we are living out that verse in John 10:10, which talks about, and you will have life in all its fullness. But we've got a long way to go. So let's see what we can learn from this passage, which gives us a picture of how that first church went about really belonging to Jesus and belonging to one another. It's quite similar, isn't it, to Acts chapter 2. If you turn back one page and see Acts chapter 2 on 1094 of your Pew Bibles, you can sort of compare and contrast. There's quite a lot of similarity, but this passage we're looking at today has a particular focus. And I want to just dig into that a bit before we start thinking, how do we apply this to our lives? First of all, back on page 1096, verse 32, it says they were of one mind and one heart. Now, that's not easy in society today to be like-minded. And there might be quite a few things that we disagree about, how we go about doing things. But the heart, one in heart and mind, is so crucial, isn't it, that we understand what God's heart is. How do we know God's heart, and how do we share it amongst ourselves so that we are all working together, singing from the same hymn sheet? How do we do that? Well, let's see some more. Verse 32, just towards the end of it, they learned something about their possessions, about how to think about the stuff they have. And that was part of what we were talking about last week, wasn't it? How do we have a better attitude to our stuff? They learnt to share it. No one claimed that any of their possessions were their own. Oh, that takes a great deal of rethinking, doesn't it? When did you last say, even perhaps as an adult, to a member of your family, that's mine? Somebody bought that for me. I know someone a long time ago who fell out with her sister over a fountain pen. Well, yeah, it sounds really silly. Can you believe it? It led to an enormous amount of grief in her family. She actually became a hoarder, starting with fountain pens. So she started collecting more and more fountain pens. And it all stemmed from the fact that her sister had laid claim to something that was actually hers. She ended up, and to be honest, I don't know the end of her story. I think she's still with us. But with her home being so full of stuff that she couldn't invite anyone round to visit because she was so ashamed of the stuff absolutely everywhere. We talked a bit about that last week, but sharing can be hard, especially if we think our security comes from what we own. Well, this community that we're reading about here didn't have that attitude. And at the center of it was verse 33, just the end of it. Can you see? It says, they continued to tell about the resurrection of Jesus, and much grace was upon them all. Now, that word grace is one we sometimes bat around rather casually. Oh, yes, but for the grace of God go I, or all those sorts of phrases. But it's an important word to understand, and it means God's goodness to us, bought at the expense of Jesus dying on the cross, and totally undeserved. We can't earn God's grace. We can't say, oh, I've lived a really good life, so therefore I deserve a place in heaven. Grace is unearned. It is a gift. And that's what they realized was really important when they started thinking about their stuff. They thought, well, I've been given so much that I don't deserve at all through Jesus dying on the cross. So the stuff I own, in theory, is actually not mine at all. Because I want to be like Jesus, giving away generous-hearted people. And what trust they had in their leaders. They put the money at the feet. I don't know whether they literally did that, but it's a symbol, isn't it, of saying this money is for you to spend as God directs you. And that's also what this chap Joseph, who became known as Barnabas, ended up doing too. Well, some people might ask questions about this way of living. First of all, you might say, is this communism? Is that what they mean by communism? Well, no, it's not communism, because everyone had their own stuff. They just chose out of their heart, out of the love that God put in them. They chose to give it to others. You might also ask, does it mean it's only for the church family? And I wanted to just ask you to turn to page 1172. Will you look that up? Grab the Bible in front of you if you want to. 1172 is from Galatians chapter 6. And the verse I want to read particularly is verse 10. Galatians chapter 6, verse 10. It says, therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers. So the message is, we start with our church family, and then we look to bless other people. And you also might say, well, what about all those needs out in the world? How do we reach all those people? And you might feel, oh, that's too big a problem. I can't cope. Sometimes we feel like that, don't we, when we think about the needs in the world. But actually, that principle might be, you might imagine a little target. The circle in the middle is your family or people you're related to, people you have a commitment to, who might be dependent on you. Start with the needs of that family. And then around that, the next circle round is church. And that's your church family, the people here, the people who belong to Jesus along with you. What are their needs? How can you meet their needs? How can you share with them? That's your next responsibility after your family. And then the big circle is your wider community, your neighborhood, your city, your town, and reaching out to the whole world. Those are the priorities that the Bible suggests we have. We might look at Acts 11, verse 29, if we want to turn to that. And it says here, the disciples, each according to their ability, decided to provide help for those living in Judea. And this they did, sending their gift to the elders by Barnabas, that chap again, and Saul. So they began to reach out beyond their own little circle. And that's what God calls us to do when we're able to. And then you might also ask another question. Won't some people end up taking advantage of living in that kind of generous community? Well, we could turn to 2 Thessalonians. It's on page 1190. 1190. Take a look at that. And see how Paul directed the Thessalonians. Struggling to get there myself. It does remind us that this is not a rule. This is not a community for people who want to just be lazy and sponge off others. In verse 10 of chapter 3, 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, it says, even when we were with you, we gave you this rule. If someone won't work, they shall not eat. So the challenge is, if you're just too lazy to lift a finger, to play a part, then you don't get to benefit from this community. So people might try to take advantage, but down to us leaders to ensure that that doesn't happen, to challenge that. Now, this way of life will attract people to Jesus because it's a genuine outworking of the love that God has put in our hearts. And I know, looking around, that many of you have experienced this kind of love, this kind of generous-hearted love from the people in this church and in other churches you may have been part of. I want you to hear a true story. It's given in this book, which is called God-Soaked Life, by a man called Chris Webb. And so settle back, close your eyes if you haven't already, and listen to this story. It was a summer evening in early 4th century Egypt, and a young man languished miserably in the belly of a boat sailing along the Nile. Just a few hours earlier, Pachomius had been sitting under a canopy in the marketplace, drinking a cool beer, barley beer, with half a dozen friends while the heat of midday passed. Amun had looked over his shoulder and whispered, "Trouble coming, my friend." And turning, Pachomius had seen the knot of Roman auxiliaries approaching. He remembered the rough, snide orders of one of the soldiers barked in his direction. A scuffle, and then the small group of youths being marched through the street with Shanut nursing a badly bruised arm and Amun bleeding from a cut above his eye. And just like that, Pachomius began a career in the Roman army, the latest involuntary conscript for Caesar. The boat pulled up to a jetty in Thebes, and Pachomius and his friends were roughly hauled ashore. The auxiliaries marched them to a small military enclosure where they found themselves locked for the night in a makeshift prison. As evening drew in, a gloomy silence settled over the group. Even Shanut's usually good humor had deserted him. Then from the darkness outside came footsteps, voices, the sound of conversation. People chatting amiably with the guards. "You may," replied one of the soldiers to an unheard question. "Thank you," came the gentle reply. "And here's something for you too, my friend." The soldier grunted. Then the door opened and 5 people came in, 2 older men, faces burned and wrinkled from years spent laboring in the burning sun, and 3 young boys carrying packs and bundles. One of the old men stretched out his hands in greeting. "My friends, you've had a hard day. Come sit with me. I have water and food. And this young man, Pishoi, has a bundle of clean clothes. Something here may fit you. Come, wash and eat." He turned to Amun. "Perhaps you'll let me clean that wound." Pachomius stepped toward him, wary. "Old man, we don't have any money for you. The soldiers took everything from us. We're poor customers for your goods, I'm afraid." The old man grinned. "Well then, it's your lucky day, my friend. No money is exactly how much I'm looking for. These are gifts. The food, drink, clothes. We don't want anything for them. Just come and join us. You're tired and hungry. Eat. You'll feel better." Pachomius paused, but then hunger overcame his caution. He took a half loaf of bread from the hands of one of the boys and greedily bit into it. It was good, still warm. He motioned the others to join him, and the boys unpacked an unprepossessing, but to Pachomius, magnificent feast of simple foods. More bread, a covered pot of mashed beans, dates and grapes, together with a couple of skins of water. As they shared the simple meal together, the young men began to relax and talk more freely. Shanut even joked about needing to take second helpings as he tried on a tunic much too large for him. Pachomius turned to the old man. "I don't understand," he told him. "We don't know you. You have no obligation to us or our families, and we don't have money to pay you. And yet you come to us in prison. You feed us, you clothe us. What are you getting out of this? Why are you doing it?" The man smiled. "Because we're followers of Christ, my friend," he replied. "This is what we do." This was a transformative experience for Pachomius. On his release from the army, he traveled back to Thebes to find the followers of Christ and was soon baptized. Looking for training in the way of life Jesus taught, he turned to the growing community of ascetics in the Egyptian desert and eventually found a community further down the river at Tabanisi, a place where people could live together and learn the way of Christ with one another. It was one of the earliest monastic communities in Egypt and became a model for similar institutions across the Middle East and Europe. By the time of his death, Pachomius had founded 8 communities consisting of several hundred monks. That's a true story of a man called Pachomius. He really did exist. And it's a real application of what Paul teaches us, to live out our lives because of what Jesus has done for us. Generous-hearted. Now, a man called Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he was a German pastor in prison, something like 1,500 years maybe from that chap Pachomius. He was in prison for resisting Hitler and the Nazi regime. And he wrote about community life because he also had experienced it. He said it's easily disregarded, trodden underfoot by those who have this gift. But it is a gift of grace, a gift of the kingdom of God that any day may be taken from us. And Bonhoeffer realized that it had been taken from him. It is grace, nothing but grace, that we are allowed to live in community. Now, we at St. Edyth are not living in community in the same way as Bonhoeffer was in those monastic communities, or either in prison either. But we can start living life in all its fullness because Jesus died for us and rose again, and we want to live that out in the way we treat our stuff, our skills, and the people around us. We can start living life in all its fullness, and we can help others to live life in all its fullness. That's our hope, and it's by the grace of God that we do that. Now, in front of those of you who are on the ends of a row, you'll see two different coloured pieces of paper. Actually, there are three different colours because I accidentally made a mistake in putting the colours in the machine. But could you try and make sure everyone in your row has got either a green and a white or a green and a purple sheet of paper? This is one way in which we might help one another to both give and receive. Because being a community, it requires us to do both. To give, maybe our time, maybe our gifts, maybe our money, maybe our stuff. But it also requires us to receive. So those two sheets of paper, take them away. It's not compulsory at all, so don't feel obliged to do this. But if you'd like to, have a think over your cup of coffee or as you get into bed. And have a think about how you would fill these out. And if you'd like to fill them out and return them, we'll have a box for you to put them in next week, the week after that, until the 22nd of September. Do think about bringing them back because we're going to gather information. And don't worry, you can either put your name down so we know straight away what your answers are, or you can tell us later. We'll ask you again, is there anything you'd like to share or anything you'd like to borrow or benefit from? That's it's only one small way in which we might extend God's grace to one another. So have a think about that. I'm going to pray now, and then we're going to stand and sing. So let's pray.